Hey everyone, I'm your host Adrian. We do content like this weekly, so hit the subscribe button and ring the bell to get notified. If you want more content like this, click the like button and please leave a comment. Thanks again for watching. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining for today's Rupa live class presented by the all-new Rupa University, the best way to learn about specialty lab work from industry experts. My name is Adrian Martinez, and as always, I will be your host for this afternoon. Today, we have a very, very special guest in Nicole Herms of Spectre Cell Laboratories here to clear up the cholesterol confusion, why the lipoprotein particle profile is a better tool for determining risk of heart disease. Before jumping in, a couple of quick housekeeping items to go over. Everyone joining will be muted by default, but don't fret. If you do have any questions, please use that Q&A button down on the bottom middle of your menu bar, and we'll host a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Immediately following the Q&A, yours truly will show you exactly how to order this test on Rupa Health. And if you have to jump early, no worries at all. We do, as always, record these sessions. And so we will send that out within the coming week. So you'll be able to review that along with the slides. And you can always find that recording also on rupauniversity.com. Additionally, if you are a fan of this type of content, be sure to check out rupauniversity.com to get access to all the previous sessions that we've done. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. I'd like to introduce Nicole Herms. Nicole is an avid proponent of incorporating lipoprotein measurement into mainstream medical practice. In the years since lipoprotein testing became widely available in 2005, she's developed training materials for practitioners who wish to integrate such diagnostics into their practice. With a degree in chemistry and master's in business, she understands both scientific and practical aspects of lab testing in today's shifting paradigm of healthcare. Nicole lives in beautiful Northern California, or Colorado, excuse me, I'm in Northern California, with her husband and 3 sons. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nicole. I'm very excited to have you here with us. I'll go ahead and let you take it from here.
Okay, sorry about that. My name is Nicole Herms. Today we're going to talk about LPP, which is the lipoprotein particle profile test that Spectre Cell offers, and how it compares to the standard cholesterol test, but also how it compares to other lipoprotein tests on the market. So this is what we're going to go over. Number one, why measure lipoproteins in the first place? Which begs the question of, why measure them over the standard cholesterol test? And then we'll talk about exactly why the standard cholesterol tests that have been used for decades are misleading at best and inaccurate at worst. We'll also talk about the NCEPT guidelines, which are the guidelines set forth by the government to recommending to physicians things to look at to better assess and stratify risk in patients. We'll talk a little bit about the LPP technology, what makes it special, and compare that to other leading technology in the lipoprotein testing market, and then how to implement the test in your practice. So just a brief history of LPP and the lab that uses it. Spectre Cell Laboratories was established in '91 in Houston, Texas as a CLIA lab. And in 2005, we introduced the lipoprotein particle profile, which around the early 2000s is when all the lipoprotein testing really started. It was a very nascent market, but that's when there were several people that came to market around the 2004-2005 period in lipoprotein testing. The LPP stands for lipoprotein particle profile, which is exactly what it is. It's a new technology compared to other lipoprotein technologies and standard cholesterol testing that specifically for measuring lipoproteins. And it was developed at Texas A&M University. Technologies were developed in academia, and then Spectre Cell brought this LPP to commercialization around 2004-2005. We got a patent issued in 2012 on the patent is actually on how we count the lipoproteins. And then we trademarked the name LPP in 2017. But the gist here is that it's not new. This test, Spectre Cell, the lab's been around for a while, but the LPP has been around for a lot, almost 2 decades. So we have a lot of clinical history with it. So why measure lipoproteins in the first place? And this is a statistic that we put in a lot of our literature, and it's that half of the people that have a heart attack have quote unquote normal cholesterol. So, and that normal cholesterol is defined as LDL cholesterol less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. So basically, if you took 1,000 people that had a heart attack and they had measured their cholesterol the day before they had a heart attack, half of them would have been normal and thought they were fine and go on their merry way. It basically is missing half of the people. The standard cholesterol test is missing half the people that are at a very high risk of a heart attack. So, it tells you that the standard cholesterol test is not really telling you, it's not telling you anything in terms of who's at risk. And this statistic is not something that we made up from our own tests or anything like that. This is it's derived from two major studies: the Framingham Heart Study, which was started in the 40s, and it basically looked at families in Framingham, Massachusetts, and tried to link any kind of biomarker with heart disease. And of course, now it looks at those people's kids and those people's kids. And this has been this ongoing study that's been trying to, looks at heart disease risk biomarkers. And in that study, they found that half the people that had normal cholesterol, half the people that had a heart attack had normal cholesterol. And then this was also confirmed in the multiple risk factor intervention trial, which we call the Mr. Fit trial, which is over 350,000 people that denoted the same thing. And there's some references if you want to delve into the research. But basically, the gist is that the standard cholesterol tests are not identifying thousands of people at risk, probably tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. And so that begs the question of, why are these standard cholesterol tests that are so ubiquitously used so misleading? And the reason is basically because there is a disconnect that exists between lipoproteins and cholesterol. So if this diagram is a picture of a lipoprotein, the lipoprotein is the lipid ball that carries cholesterol throughout the body. And so lipoprotein is a ball made of fat that has a special protein attached to it. That protein, which is called its apolipoprotein, determines what kind of lipoprotein it is and certain properties, but it's basically a ball of fat with a special protein on it. And that the lipoproteins are what are the actual culprit in heart disease, not cholesterol. So if you think of the, your blood vessels like a pipe, the lipoproteins, not all of them, but some of them, and some worse than others, they will actually cause abrasions to the vascular architecture. They'll burrow into the endothelial lining and cause inflammation, and they're the culprits. And so, but they carry cholesterol around. So in this pipe analogy, if there's a scratch on the pipe, lipoprotein, there are other things causes vascular damage too. Obviously, high blood sugar causes it, homocysteine. But in the lipid metabolism world, the lipoproteins often cause this vascular damage. Then when the vascular damage occurs, there is there's an injury to the wall, and then lipoproteins come along and put cholesterol on that, kind of like a spackle, like a vascular spackle, or they're like a scab, and they're depositing cholesterol where the damage occurred. So what you want to do is not create the damage in the first place. But you can only correct that by seeing what lipoproteins the person has that may be causing damage. The cholesterol inside them is only a surrogate marker. And so how the standard cholesterol test works is you basically just take a bunch of lipoproteins and enzymatically blow up the lipoprotein particles so that the cholesterol spills out, and then you measure the cholesterol content inside. That's why cholesterol is measured in milligrams per deciliter, and lipoproteins are measured in particle numbers. So the standard cholesterol tests are measuring cholesterol, which is the innocent bystander. They're not measuring lipoproteins, which is what is actually causing the plaque in heart disease. So why is this a problem? Well, number one, like we just said, it's the lipoproteins causing harm, not the cholesterol. But there's a second problem that is not very much addressed, but is equally as impactful on why cholesterol testing can be so misleading. And that is because standard cholesterol testing assumes everyone has the same amount of cholesterol in their lipoproteins, which is absolutely not the case. Not all lipoproteins have equal cholesterol. It varies significantly from person to person, and it can vary within a person, and it can vary in the same person over time if they have, if their metabolic function changes. So the standard cholesterol test does not consider cholesterol depleted or cholesterol enriched people. And 30% of the population are cholesterol depleted, and 1/5 of the population are cholesterol enriched. So what does this mean? If you look at this picture, if this normal lipoprotein on the left is a lipoprotein filled with a quote unquote normal amount of cholesterol, then you can see this middle one, this would be considered a cholesterol depleted person. And so this person has the same lipoprotein, but the amount of cholesterol in that lipoprotein is much lower. And so when you measure this on the standard cholesterol assay, it will register as very low. This person will think they're fine, and it will potentially, in many cases, underestimate risk, very much so. Conversely, if you have the same lipoprotein and it is like filled to the brim with cholesterol, then if you measure this test on the standard cholesterol assay, their cholesterol would register as extremely high, which has the potential to totally overestimate risk. But what is particularly interesting is that this is especially common. This cholesterol depletion phenomena is especially common in people that have high triglycerides, which are over 100 milligrams per deciliter of triglycerides, or low HDL. And that is the exact people that you really need to determine that are higher risk of heart disease, that you really need to figure out what lipoproteins are elevated so you can treat them properly. But this cholesterol depletion, cholesterol enrichment, which completely skews the standard cholesterol testing result for clinical interpretation, is half of the population, which is why half the people who have a heart attack have normal cholesterol by standard cholesterol testing. So, what is the origin or the reason for the LDL cholesterol content variation? Well, the one that we just spoke about is that there's variability in the core lipid composition, which is basically in that lipoprotein ball. Some people have they're filled to the brim with cholesterol, and some people have very little cholesterol. And so there's variability in how much lipid that lipoprotein is, how much cholesterol that lipoprotein is carrying. And this is a very dynamic process, the amount of cholesterol within the lipoproteins. So if you have if there's high triglycerides in the blood, those triglycerides will be exchanged with cholesterol and vice versa. So metabolically, it's a very dynamic process. And when those high triglycerides are exchanged with cholesterol, what happens is the lipoprotein becomes cholesterol depleted. This occurs when triglycerides are high, which we know that when triglycerides are high, that's usually a metabolic problem, and people that are at risk of high risk of a cardiac event. So when you have high triglycerides, those triglycerides are displacing the cholesterol in the lipoproteins, and so you become a cholesterol depleted person. When you measure that with a standard cholesterol assay, it's going to register as low cholesterol. You're totally going to underestimate risk. So you're completely missing the whole picture. But there's also another contributing factor to LDL cholesterol content variation, which is that there is variability in lipoprotein particle size. So when LDL cholesterol is depleted in a lipoprotein, that lipoprotein will actually undergo a structural change and transform into a smaller, denser LDL particle, which can also be cholesterol depleted and transform further into a smaller, dense LDL particle. So what happens is when you have this high triglycerides, in many cases, it drives the lipoproteins to transform to smaller, denser LDLs. Well, guess what? Small, dense LDLs are more likely to abrade the vascular lining and burrow into the endothelial lining and cause plaque and buildup. So basically different LDL particles are created, and this is, like I said, it's a dynamic process where your lipid metabolism, your particles are changing size and number, continuously. And so the good news is that these reactions are fully reversible. So, but what is interesting, we were talking about, a person with really high triglycerides. If you have a successful triglyceride lowering therapy, in other words, you get their triglycerides down, what will happen is that their LDL particle number will actually decrease, which is a very good thing, because you're they're not transforming to create smaller, denser LDLs anymore. So you've lowered their triglycerides, their particle number decreases, which is what you want. But interestingly, their LDL cholesterol, when measured with the standard cholesterol assay, can actually increase, which is a misunderstood effect. And so when you lower their triglycerides and you measure theirs with a standard cholesterol test, their cholesterol may have gone up. You think, what's going on? We need to do something else, but it's a misunderstood effect. If you looked at the particle numbers, you would see their risk is actually reduced. And similarly, there's the clinical implications of having low HDL cholesterol. There's data that suggests that the risk of low HDL it actually stems from an unrecognized excess number of LDL particles that are cholesterol depleted. In other words, HDL is both a marker of heart disease, but also can be a cause of heart disease. And so the takeaway here is that the standard cholesterol tests are totally misleading. And this is a graphic that kind of drives this point home. If you look at these 4 people, and you measured their cholesterol with the standard cholesterol assay, all of them register at 125 milligrams per deciliter, you'd say, okay, they're great, that's good, they're healthy. But if you look, this guy, Jerry, on the left, he's got a very large, buoyant, fluffy lipoprotein that is filled with cholesterol. He's at less risk because the lipoprotein is bigger, so it doesn't cause as much damage, and there's less of them. If you go over here to the right, this person, Maria, has she has many more lipoproteins, so a higher lipoprotein number, and they're smaller and denser. So it's a double whammy. She's at much higher risk. But if you do a standard cholesterol assay, all 4 of these people will register the same. So cholesterol tests are totally misleading. So moving on to the different lipoproteins. Before we talk about the different lipoproteins, there's kind of 3 things to discuss about what makes them potentially bad and heart disease causing. Number 1 is the type of lipoprotein it is. In other words, whether it's an LDL or an HDL, or there's other lipoproteins within the LDL range, that is determined by its apolipoprotein. Like the lipid ball, it has this protein on it, and that protein determines the type of lipoprotein it is. So that's one thing. The second is how many there are. So if you have a bad lipoprotein, you want less of them. That makes sense. And then the third is the density versus buoyancy of that lipoprotein. But this is where it can kind of get confusing. This is only within a subgroup. And so if you look at this scale, the left is the most buoyant and fluffiest lipoproteins, and the right is the denser lipoproteins. If you only looked at density versus buoyancy, you would think that this HDL2 and HDL3 they're denser than the low density lipoproteins. They're denser than these over here, but they're beneficial because of the apolipoprotein that is embedded in its lipid shell. So within a subgroup, i.e. within the LDL group, density versus buoyancy matters. So what that means is within a subgroup, bigger is better, bigger is fluffier, smaller is more dangerous. And that makes sense because if you think of a lipoprotein, like if in a pipe, you've got a bunch of big fluffy marbles rolling around, they're not as likely going to do damage to the wall of the pipe as if you had a bunch of tiny little BBs. Those tiny little BBs would be like the small dense LDL. They're more likely to get into the vascular endothelium and do damage. So one thing I wanted to mention here, which we'll go over in a second, which is a unique lipoprotein called lipoprotein a. And its density actually overlaps LDL and HDL2, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. So it is a really unique one that is particularly dangerous, but it's dangerous because of the apolipoprotein that's on it. So moving on to the NCEP guideline. NCEP is the National Cholesterol Education Program that was started in the mid-'80s, and this was created by the NIH because everybody was dying of heart attacks. And so the government was like, okay, we need to put some research into figuring out, how to find out who's at risk of heart disease and that kind of thing. Because a lot of the people that were dying of heart attacks, their first symptom was a heart attack or even sudden death. And so they created these things called the ATP, Adult Treatment Panel recommendations. Over the years, they've evolved. So the first one in 1988 was basically just the recommendation that your cholesterol, that you should measure your total cholesterol should be under 200. And so we know now that's outdated. In 93, they had ATP2, which was basically saying, okay, well, now you should also look at your HDL and your LDL, but it still wasn't telling the big picture. So the ATP3 was in 2002, which is right around when the lipoprotein technologies were becoming commercially available. The NCEPT published 4 emerging risk factors, and they said basically above and beyond cholesterol testing, you should be measuring these 4 risk factors. That was emerging then. Now it's 20 years later, they're not really emerging anymore, but you should be measuring these risk factors because it will help you. The goal was to better stratify risk in people and determine the best course of treatment, because the best way to treat and reduce heart disease depended on which lipoprotein was elevated. So these are the, and the ATP4, by the way, I think that one was mostly about pharmaceutical interventions and stuff and recommending statins. So of these 4 risk factors, these are the 4-sided risk factors above cholesterol testing that are recommended to measure. One is small dense LDL, which is the most common. I think every lipoprotein test reports small dense LDL. The second is RLP, or remnant lipoprotein. The third is lipoprotein little a. These first 3 are all bad. And then the fourth is HDL2B, a subtype of high density lipoproteins, which is good. You want more of it. And consequently, LPP measures and reports all 4 risk factors, which is important. So a little on each risk factor. In a gist, basically, they're all harmful in different ways, except for HDL2B. They're a little small dense LDL. It basically, like my analogy I was talking about with a pipe, you have like a bunch of little BBs versus big marbles. Those BBs are going to cause more damage. So the small dense, because they're smaller, they can easily penetrate the arterial endothelium and cause plaque. And it's important to look at both the size and number, because you want larger LDL and you want less of them, less LDL total. But with small dense LDL, it's pretty intuitive how they cause damage. Remnant lipoprotein is a little bit different. It's the building block of plaque. In other words, it's the same composition, and they there was a bunch of studies where they did autopsies on people that had heart attacks from cholesterol buildup, and that cholesterol buildup, when they did the autopsy, that is filled with RLP. It's like that's what makes the plaque and kind of all the foam cells kind of get together or whatever. And the thing about RLP that's particularly dangerous is that it does not need to be, excuse me, oxidized to cause harm. Unlike LDL, small dense LDL needs to be oxidized before it can cause damage. RLP does not, and which makes it more prone to damage. Obviously, a lot of us have inflammation. If you have poor lipid metabolism, there's probably inflammation, and you have oxidative stress going on anyway. So if you have oxidative stress, you're going to be oxidizing these lipoproteins, but RLP doesn't need to be oxidized, and it's going to cause damage no matter what, even if you have, completely healthy from a oxidative stress standpoint. The third one, lipoprotein little a, is a little different than the others. What makes it different is this apolipoprotein little a. That's what it's called, apolipoprotein little a, which is embedded in the lipid shell. And this apolipoprotein little a is similar in structure to the molecule plasminogen. So it blocks the receptor site for plasminogen, which then prevents clots from dissolving by inhibiting plasmin. And so a lot of people with elevated LP little a will be prone to thrombosis and blood clots. In addition, LP little a is very, very easily oxidized, and thus contributing to plaque, independent of its thrombotic potential. So it's a kind of a double whammy. It's a particularly dangerous one, also difficult to treat, but not impossible. And then HDL2B, which is good. You want more of it, more while cholesterol is being cleared by the liver. So again, why test the risk factors besides just kind of knowing? Well, the big reason is because the treatment will depend on which lipoprotein is elevated. So for example, small dense LDL, the most effective treatment, at least medically, I mean, lifestyle interventions and losing weight, lowering inflammation, that kind of stuff is good for everything, dense LDL. However, remnant lipoprotein does not respond to statins. And so it's important to know they respond very well to high dose pharmacological dosages of omega-3 fatty acids. And like usually like 2 to 3 grams of fatty acids per day, which is a very, very high dose, you know, is for some people, but it is very effective at lowering RLP. Lipoprotein little a is a lipoprotein that's kind of, it's very genetically driven. And the standard course of treatment right now is niacin, which is vitamin B3, will often lower it. There's other nutrients. There's some studies that show other nutrients like cysteine, N-acetylcysteine, or coenzyme Q10, vitamin C. I've seen a study on carnitine that those nutrients can also lower lipoprotein little a in some people. The research is not as, you know, it's certainly nothing compared to the pharmacological interventions, but there is evidence that suggests that lipoprotein little a can be reduced by correcting certain nutrient deficiencies. But right now, niacin is what treats it the most. And by the way, lipoprotein little a also doesn't respond to statins. And one note about niacin, niacin, I think it's like usually a dosage like 500 milligrams. And a lot of times when you take that dosage, you'll get a flushing response. And sometimes patients hate that. And so they'll choose a niacin that is like extended release that doesn't, you don't have a flushing response. The problem is they unknowingly choose that. It doesn't change their lipid profile, but the extended release does not have the effect on lipid metabolism that the flushing, the niacin that causes flushing do. So it's kind of one of those things that the flushing is just, you have to kind of accept that. A lot of people take that when they go to sleep or whatever, so they flush when they're at sleep or whatever. It's not that bad of a, I've taken niacin, it's not that bad of a, for some, and if you take it over time, the flushing response kind of decreases, but the extended release niacin that does not flush does not affect lipids, unfortunately. And then with HDL, usually the most effective treatments are usually lifestyle related, exercise, but particularly lowering inflammation so that your liver can work more effectively at clearing out cholesterol. So an example I wanted to mention here about why measure the specific lipoproteins is because statins, like I said, don't, I mean, RLP or LP little a do not respond to statins. And another thing to mention is that statins don't change the particle size. They only change the particle number. So, you know, statins are really ubiquitously prescribed, but they're not reaching a lot of people that could be benefited by other therapies. And we'll go over a case study in a second. Another example is like phenofibrates are often prescribed to lower HDL, but those will tend to raise LP little a. So if you're only, you know, if you're measuring the standard cholesterol test, or you're only looking at small dense LDL and none of the other NSAID risk factors, you're totally missing the picture of what can really help the patient. So, and a note on statins that I wanted to mention is, you know, statins do have side effects, even though they're kind of much, you know, statins cause a depletion in coenzyme Q10, which most people know. In fact, that's actually in a lot of the patents, that it disrupts the metabolic pathway for CoQ10, and that CoQ10 deficiency is a real risk factor. The original patent for some of the statins had CoQ10 with the statin, but CoQ10 is pretty expensive, and so they patented it without it. But It's well established that it depletes CoQ10, but it also has an effect and depletes many of these other nutrients: vitamin D, selenium, vitamin E, magnesium, zinc. I mean, magnesium and zinc are used in 300 different metabolic reactions in the body. If you're depleting it, it's there are side effects of statins. They're just not as the research isn't as copious, if you will. But all of this, we have a lot of medical research that supports it. So if you're treating with a statin because you don't know, you're not looking at the right lipoprotein, it can have consequences. And so this is a really good case study that illustrates this point. This is a 53-year-old female that was prescribed Lipitor prior to getting an LPP. She was prescribed a Lipitor based on a standard cholesterol test, and she developed muscle pain, which is not a surprise. It's common with high-dose statins. And so originally the doctor suggested she increase her statin dosage based on the standard lipid panel. So in her first lipid test, her total cholesterol was 316, which is considered pretty high. Her triglycerides were 244, also very high, and her RLP was 181 on her first LPP. So this LDL profile is particularly dangerous. Absolutely, her risk is elevated. So she had an LPP, saw that she had elevated RLP and elevated small dense LDL. She also had a micronutrient test done, and among other nutrient deficiencies, she had a deficiency in CoQ10, which is completely not surprising at all, likely caused by the statins. Interestingly, we don't do this test anymore, but at the time we did, and she had a genetic test on ApoE done. And what's interesting is she had the genotype that tends not to respond to statins. So the therapy, because she had elevated RLP, she took high dose omega-3 fatty acids. I don't remember what dosage, but it was at least 2 grams. It was 2 to 3 grams. And a couple of years later, she had a healthy profile. Her total cholesterol was down to 243. Her triglycerides were down to 70, and her RLP was down to 133. All of these in the normal range, and her LDL profile was healthy. And she reduced her statin dose, which is huge. So moving on to talk about the LPP technology and what makes it so special, and then comparing it to other technologies on the market. Or one is the standard ApoB test, and the other is comparing it to NMR technology. So the LPP was originally developed at Texas A&M, and basically there's 2 steps in the LPP. Step one is to separate all of the lipoproteins, and step 2 is to count those specific lipoproteins. The first step, the separation, is we separate the lipoproteins by density, and that we use analytical ultracentrifugation, it's the industry gold standard. And when I say industry gold standard, I mean like in the 90s and the early 2000s, when all of the lipoprotein technologies were starting to move out of academia and into the commercial market. There's a huge a handbook of lipoprotein testing that was like the Bible of lipoprotein testing, and it stated that analytical ultracentrifugation was the best method available for separating lipoproteins, which is that's what SpectraCell uses. The second step of the LPP is, once those lipoproteins are completely separated, the particles themselves are directly measured using a fluorescent dye. We don't measure the cholesterol within them, we count the particles. And so the result is that we have a report that has particle numbers and has density. So this is basically like, if this is a lipoprotein, after we've separated all the lipoproteins, we introduce this fluorescent dye, which has like a hydrophobic end. And when this hydrophobic end embeds into the phospholipid shell of the lipoprotein, the hydrophilic end fluoresces, and then we can count them extremely precisely. And so it's the fluorescence is a direct measurement of particle number. And that is really what the patent's all about, is the whole method of counting the lipoproteins. It's extremely accurate and precise. So I wanted to compare LPP against apolipoprotein B. So apolipoprotein B is it commonly used, like it's better than the standard cholesterol test, but it's not quite as good as a direct lipoprotein particle measurement. And the reason is it's sometimes been called poor man's particle number, because the apolipoprotein B is the lipoprotein that is in each low density lipoprotein. Okay, so and its function is that it allows cholesterol to be delivered throughout the body. There's two forms. There's B100, which is in the liver, and there's apolipoprotein B48, which is in the small intestine, which is important because every low density lipoprotein, whether it is VLDL, which is very low density lipoprotein, IDL, intermediate density, LP(a), or LDL, every single one of them has just one ApoB100 attached to it. So that number is generally indicative of atherogenic lipoprotein particles. And the problem is that free ApoB exists in the blood. And so when you measure it in the blood, there's going to be errors in number. That's one problem. The second problem is that there's two issues. There's assessing risk, and then there's how to treat it. Apolipoprotein B100 identifies high-risk patients, those patients that have a high amount of LDLs, but it does not tell you what to do about it because it does not tell you what lipoproteins are elevated. Comparison of SpectraCell's LPP against the other three technologies that emerged at the same time, like around 2004. So SpectraCell, there's two issues with lipoprotein testing. There's the separation technology, which for SpectraCell, it's excellent. We use analytical ultracentrifugation. And then there is the second issue of, are you measuring cholesterol, or are you counting the actual lipoproteins, or just the cholesterol within them? SpectraCell is great separation technology, and we directly measure the lipoproteins. VAP came around about the same time, and I just wanted to mention it here. It's not that common anymore, but VAP also uses analytical ultracentrifugation. However, it's vertical. VAP stands for vertical autoprofile. So it's like if you took like a tube like this and you centrifuged it vertically, there's very little space for the lipoprotein to separate across the diameter of the tube. Whereas the LPP is centrifuged like this, and so it's easier to separate the lipoproteins. Plus the LPP separation, we run a very higher RPMs, and the separation is very precise. But with VAP, even though it uses analytical ultracentrifugation, because it's vertical, a lot of times the lipoproteins will get stuck to the tube, which causes errors. And so their separation technology, it's poor. But combine that with the fact that they don't then count the lipoproteins, they just measure the cholesterol inside. So it kind of went into oblivion a little bit, but this was all in the early 2000s when these were the technologies that kind of came to market, and only a few remain now. NMR is different. NMR is nuclear magnetic resonance, and we'll talk about this more in a second. But the separation technology is poor because they actually don't even separate the lipoproteins, which is a big deal. However, they do at least measure, like count the actual lipoproteins, or use a mathematical formula to report them. Electrophoresis is a technology that was used like by Berkeley, and it was excellent separation technology where you're taking the lipoproteins and kind of they're going down like a gel plate and being separated by size. But they with electrophoresis, it's just a separation technology, and they're often measuring just the cholesterol, not the lipoproteins. So the SpectraCell actually has excellent separation, and we measure the lipoproteins directly. So now the biggest technology that's out there is NMR, because both Quest and LabCorp have lipoprotein tests that use NMR. And so it was developed in North Carolina, but it was sold long time ago. And so that's what the NMR technology has kind of replaced sometimes the cholesterol test. However, there's some big problems from a clinical standpoint with NMR that aren't really appreciated. But basically in NMR, the lipoprotein broadcasts a unique sound, and then a computer will convert that NMR signal to a lipoprotein subclass, okay? So they're not separating the lipoproteins. They're kind of bombarding it with energy and then trying to deconvolute that signal. Here's the problem. The big problem is that there's a huge overlap between NMR signals. So you can't kind of sift through the lipoproteins, the subtle variations in size of lipoproteins, which is a huge problem. There's a lot of research that suggests it's no better than measuring apolipoprotein B, which is just a measure of how many LDL particles you have, not what kind of LDL particles those are. And there's another problem, which is that the lipoproteins are altered during the cooking process, which is basically those lipoproteins change due to the heat applied that to make the lipoproteins resonate. So the test itself actually changes the lipoproteins. So what does this mean clinically? The result is that you have a very high potential to overstate the number of patients with high risk when you use lipoprotein tests from NMR technology. In fact, a lot of times NMR technology they'll say that over 90% of the results are high risk, which is really not the case. They're about 40% higher than other methods, which can lead to overtreatment. So this is an internal study that was not published, but where we did a study where we looked at 50 samples and we performed both NMR and the LPP on them. Of those 50 samples, NMR, 90% of them had high levels of small dense LDL, which suggests that those patients should be aggressively treated with statins. Now remember, statins do not change particle number. They don't change particle size, they only change the particle number. The LPP results said that only 30% of the samples had high amounts of small dense LDL. So that begs the question, why such a discrepancy? And I alluded to it in the previous slide, but basically NMR will, it's nuclear magnetic resonance. So they're applying energy to these molecules to make them vibrate. And they heat the samples to 117 degrees, which activates CETP. CETP is an enzyme, cholesterol ester transfer protein, that will denature the lipoproteins. And what ultimately happens is CETP, which is activated during the test, will remove triglycerides from the LDLs. Those LDLs become cholesterol depleted, then undergo a structural change and transform into a smaller, denser LDL particle. So we had talked about that before. When you have high triglycerides, it can transform the LDLs to be smaller and denser, but also this enzyme, CETP, does the same thing, which is activated in NMR testing because they heat the sample up. And so the test itself is potentially changing the lipoproteins in the blood. And so what happens is the number of small dense LDL is overstated in many, many cases. And if that's the case, then the potential for overtreatment, prescribing something that they don't need, is very high when using NMR. So this was an internal study done, but the same information is also in larger studies, which I want to talk about. So here's a study that was published in Circulation, I think in 2010, that compared lipid results using standard cholesterol testing to NMR testing for lipoproteins in 27,000 healthy women, and they correlated those results with cardiovascular incidence. So, which is what we care about, is the actual incident of heart disease. Heart disease or stroke events. So this is what they concluded, that in this study of healthy women, the risk prediction associated with lipoprotein profiles evaluated by NMR was comparable, but not superior to that of standard lipids or apolipoproteins. And essentially no reclassification improvement, meaning no more information that will help you determine who's really at risk, was found with the addition of LDL particle concentration when tested via NMR. So this is saying that NMR lipoprotein testing is no better than apolipoprotein B or standard cholesterol testing, which is huge. This was, and then we have a couple of conclusions also. When we looked at NMR and LPP compared to like apolipoprotein B and different lipid tests, we found that the NMR correlation coefficient was much lower than LPP. And we have this information, written up if you want to really delve into the details. But with correlation coefficient, like a correlation of 1 is perfect correlation. A correlation of 0 is like there's no correlation. A correlation of 0.5 is basically random. There's not very little correlation. Anything above 0.8 would be considered a significant or meaningful correlation. And a lot of the correlation with NMR for different lipid parameters was below a meaningful correlation. It's not telling you any more than the standard cholesterol test. So here is another study that is saying the same thing. This was in the Journal of Clinical Lipidology, published in 2015. Where it compared apolipoprotein B. So the last one was standard cholesterol testing. This one was apolipoprotein B with lipoproteins measured via NMR on 400,000 people, and then also on 1,400 people with a specific cardiac history. And their conclusions stated discordance was associated with insulin resistance, smaller LDL particle size, increased inflammation, and low levels of traditional lipids. And there was discordance associated with larger LDL particle sizes and elevated levels of lipoprotein a. So what does that mean in plain English? It means that discordance between ApoB and lipoprotein testing via NMR is very widespread. And that occurs in patients that have insulin resistance, high lipoprotein a, or patients that use a statin, which is, in other words, most patients and the exact patients that you really want to know more specifically how to treat them, i.e. more specifically which lipoproteins are elevated. And this discordance, like I mentioned in the previous slide, was not seen with LPP. And so the takeaway is that the discordance, i.e. the inaccuracy of lipoprotein testing via NMR is likely due to the experimental error that occurs with the deconvolution of the NMR signal. So in plain English, that means that the test itself, that they use heat and then they're using a signal instead of actually, they don't separate the lipoproteins. It's sort of a totally different, completely different way of approaching it. There is a lot of error in that method, and that is contributes to the fact that NMR does not correlate very well in people with like insulin resistance that use a statin and that kind of thing. So these are a couple of flyers that really go into the details and have the medical references if you want to look these up, that just compare LPP versus NMR, because NMR is basically what the market is mostly NMR. Like I said, Quest and LabCorp, that's what they both have NMR lipoprotein profiles. So people think, okay, I'm not measuring standard cholesterol test, I'm measuring lipoprotein profiles. My report is saying it's in nanomoles per liter, but they don't understand if it's NMR, there are some very, very big inherent problems with that technology when looking at lipoproteins. So this is what a lipoprotein, an LPP report looks like. You've got 3 sections. The first is the lipoprotein particle numbers, which we report 8 different subclasses. And then we also have this section called a lipid panel, which is the standard lipid panel, which I know I've been bashing the standard cholesterol test this whole talk, but people still want to see it. So this is a completely different assay. We just run a standard cholesterol test on every LPP, just so it's on the report, because patients still want to see their total cholesterol. And probably the most useful thing on it is the triglycerides, but we include it just really for posterity's sake, because people still like to see it. And then we have this section down here that's called vascular inflammation, but it's different. These are all additional biomarkers: insulin, CRP, lipoprotein a, ApoB and ApoA1, and homocysteine are all included in the LPP. Now, I'm not talking about these today because these are really pretty commodity, except for the LP but they're commodity tests, but we include it in the LPP because it paints an even bigger picture. One thing I wanted to mention about lipoprotein a is, I'll get to that in a second. Another thing I just wanted to mention again is that in the LPP, you have all 4 risk factors. So you have your RLP, your dense LDL4. Dense LDL4 is the same thing as small dense LDL. and HDL2B, which we call buoyant HDL2B. These are all NSEP risk factors, and LP(a). They're all reported on the LPP test. But speaking of the LP(a), that one's a little different because this is the second page of the report, and we give this graph, by the way. On this graph, the x-axis is density. And so some doctors love this graph, and some doctors feel like it's too much information, and their patients ask too many questions about it. It's kind of a love-hate relationship, but we're kind of on the side of providing the most information possible. So we still include the graph. It's the same information, just presented differently. But one thing I wanted to mention about this is LP(a), as I had mentioned before, has a density that overlaps. It's like right here in LDL4 and HDL2B. LP(a) overlaps this region. And so it's a unique risk factor because it is very difficult to separate by density. You can't separate it because it overlaps both of those sections. And so what SpectraCell does is we actually measure it directly. We separate it by its apolipoprotein, which is the apolipoprotein (a). We remove all the LP(a) and then we directly measure it. And that is because it overlaps this LDL4 and HDL range. That's important because when you go back to this page, LP(a) is reported in milligrams per deciliter, which is like not particle number, that's cholesterol. But that is because it is difficult to separate by density because the density overlaps two main regions. And as a result, we separate LP(a) by its apolipoprotein and remove it and do a direct assay that's only LP(a), which is as accurate as you can get. So it's kind of not appreciated what's involved in testing LP(a), but it's such a good marker. We include it and measure it directly. So in conclusion, why LPP is better than other technologies. The reason number one is because standard cholesterol testing misses most people, so you have the risk of undertreatment, while NMR testing, you overestimates risk, and LPP does not do either. It's very specific and accurate. And it's precise because LPP, we report 8 particle subclasses. Most NMR reports, if you look at them, it's only 3 subclasses, and those aren't even separated subclasses. The third reason is because our separation technology is very, very precise. We use analytical ultracentrifugation, which is good. NMR does not even separate the lipoproteins. It's a totally different way of reporting lipoproteins. Reason number 4, we test and measure all 4 NSEP risk factors, which is important. But the reason number 5 is because it's really just as easy to get as a standard cholesterol test. There's no weird stuff you have to do. It's a fasting test. And it's costs about the same as other lipoprotein tests on there. So it's not, there's no reason not to do it. And then as far as implementation in your practice, I think Adrian might go over this a little bit, but it's usually a turnaround time of about a week for an LPP. Small amount of serum, the tubes and everything is contained in the kit. You saw the report, it's pretty intuitive. And then we also have a lot of support for both patients and physicians on basically the disconnect between lipoproteins and cholesterol, and information on NMR technology compared to LPP and that kind of thing. And even this flyer up here is a flyer on nutrient interactions with dyslipidemia. It's a lot of medical references. So we've been doing this test for 18 years. So we have a lot of resources to help doctors help their patients accept that this is a better way to assess cardiovascular risk. Then we, how often should you retest? And that really depends on the goal of the person. If it's a person who's trying to actively alter their lipid profile, like they've started a new medication, or they're like really changing their lifestyle, giving up something, refined carbs or something, they're really doing something aggressively to change their heart disease risk. Every 2 months is not too often if you're really actively trying to change something. But for patients who have just some modifiable risk factors like weight, or they're trying to lower their blood pressure and they're not aggressively working on it, 6 months would be good. And then for healthy people, like I do my LPP once a year, just to, as a routine measure. That's it.
All right, Nicole, that was amazing. Thank you so much for that presentation. Super insightful. We had actually a ton of questions come in, and if you have any more questions, feel free to use that Q&A button down on the bottom of your menu bar, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And just a quick time check, we are almost at the hour, so if you have to jump off, no worries at all. We do always record these, so you can always check out the Q&A session during the recording that we'll send out in the next week or so. So the first question actually came in very early, so you probably answered it throughout, but what's new with the LPP, and how is the correlation between the LPP and triglyceride?
Well, the LPP is the whole profile. Okay, so the LPP is not just one lipoprotein, it's the whole profile of your lipoproteins. So in that profile, usually the thing that correlates with triglycerides the most is RLP. RLP will be elevated when you have elevated triglycerides in many cases. And consequently, the best treatment for RLP is high dose omega-3 fatty acids, which is also the best treatment for high triglycerides in many cases. So
perfect. So the next one, homocysteine, when it's high or extremely high in the triple digits, is your understanding that some, most, or all of the vascular damages body-wide are reversible?
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. It's a good question because it depends on how you measure vascular damage. I mean, you can measure it, your lipoprotein particle profile will give you a hint as to what vascular damage may have been done. But that might be more like your carotid artery thickness tests and stuff, which is different. So I don't know how to measure vascular damage, like on the molecular level kind of, but certainly if you have vascular damage, but you have a really healthy LPP, that would be unusual. You know what I mean? Like if you can remove plaque, a lot of the plaque buildup, which I guess would be, when you say vascular damage, there's the actual damage to the artery, and then there's the response to that damage. The response to that damage is plaque buildup, maybe high blood pressure, that kind of thing. And you can definitely change the response to that damage, over time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that leads kind of almost into the follow-up question is are you familiar with any of the important treatment considerations for the damages that might be due to this?
Well, it depends on, like I said, it depends on what, from a lipoprotein standpoint, it depends on which lipoprotein is elevated, the best treatment, so like we said, if your RLP is elevated, taking a statin is not going to do anything. Mm-hmm. High dose omega-3 fatty acids are absolutely effective. And so it depends on what's elevated. Now, remember, there was that little section of the LPP report that I just brushed over because they're not unique to SpectraCell. They're commodity tests, but they're all really important. CRP is inflammation. I mean, lowering your inflammation is huge, and so that's kind of another webinar really, but there's a lot of other information on there. Insulin is on there. So lowering your insulin, because insulin can cause vascular damage too. So if you have high insulin and you're metabolically, all your lipids are jacked up, well, lowering your insulin is definitely going to be helpful in that case. And it depends on the person. If this is a, overweight smoker versus endurance athletes, because we've seen healthy, athletes that have, especially football players. There's a lot of studies that show that football players have poor lipid metabolism, but you have athletes that, have a very unhealthy lipid profile. So, it's hard to say without looking at, patient by patient, but the LPP gives you so much information on where to start because it's not just lipoproteins. We measure inflammation and, insulin, homocysteine, and all that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such an important thing is get the information, depends on the patient before you go into treatment. The next question, and it's okay if you don't have the answer to this at the moment or off the top of your head, but what are the citations for those studies comparing LPP to NMR?
I can send them to you. They're, they might be listed in the presentation, some of them, but there's also those, I showed a picture of those flyers that we have, and I think those flyers have the medical references. They should.
So quick question, just specifically to just the LPP test. How does it differ to others that might be on the market, or maybe how is it similar even?
Well, it's different. The other major one on the market is NMR technology. And the big thing about NMR is it's a technology that basically they bombard the blood, excuse me, with energy, the lipoproteins vibrate, and then they take that and mathematically derive what the lipoproteins are. There's problems with the lipoproteins changing during the test, and also they don't separate the lipoproteins. So the technology is not accurate, nor is it precise. LPP is accurate because we're counting the lipoproteins specifically through the fluorescence technology. It's very accurately counting them, but it's very precise too because of the way we separate it.
Which leads really well into this next question is, would NMR overestimate all lipoprotein particles in a sample, or would it potentially just overestimate just one or two particles?
I don't know if it overestimates small dense LDL, but it doesn't report in the other ones. If you look at an NMR report, it doesn't have LP little a, it doesn't have RLP, so it's not overestimating them, but that's because it's not measuring them.
And then the last question that we had come in, y'all, these have been great questions, is do statins raise LP little a?
I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know. LP little a is kind of an enigma sometimes. It's kind of like the weird stepchild of lipoproteins. It's very genetically driven, and it's notoriously hard to treat, unfortunately, and it's very dangerous. I don't know if statins affect it, if it increases it. I know that statins do not lower it, though.
Yeah, makes sense. So last question coming in from Claire. Does SpectraCell offer clinical consultations to review tests?
I think so. We have in the past. We're going through a transition period right now, but we have had in the past clinical consultations. Our other main test is a micronutrient test, and so probably 90% of the clinical consultations are on that test, not on the LPP, but we do both.
Yep, perfect. And if those clinical consults are available, you can always schedule them through Rupa with SpectraCell as well. So, thank you so much for joining us, Nicole. That was an amazing presentation. We're so excited for this to be posted, to share out with everybody. Any final thoughts?
No.
I love it. Well, I'll let you hop off, or you can actually stay around if you want. What I'm going to transition to, y'all, if you are free for the next 10 or so minutes, is just to show you exactly how to order this LPP test directly on Rupa Health. So thanks again, Nicole, so much for joining us today. That was an amazing presentation and some amazing questions. So for those of y'all who are able to stick around and chat a little bit, I'm going to walk you through Rupa Health and show you exactly why we host these conversations on a weekly basis with our amazing lab partners like SpectraCell. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we can just jump right into it. So for those of y'all who are new and have questions and say, hey, who's Rupa Health? Why are y'all always hosting these functional lab conversations that everybody loves so much? Well, we're a functional lab platform that's designed to make life easier when it comes to ordering tests. And, at the current landscape of testing, most practitioners order from multiple labs, right? You might be working with 3, 4, 5, maybe even more labs at any given time. And that just within itself provides a bit of a speed bump, right? You have to go to set up individual accounts with each of the labs that you want to work with. You have to go to each one to order your test, to track and manage your results. Well, with Rupa Health, our platform has brought on over 30 different labs, including, of course, SpectraCell, all in one place. So now you just need one account with Rupa Health, and we can take it from there. You can order from SpectraCell, Dutch, Genova, Diagnostic Solutions, all from one account. You don't have to go and set up separate accounts, right? It's a free to sign up for platform, and not only can you order all your tests in one place, but you can also manage all of your results in one place. So again, one streamlined platform where you can order all your tests and track and manage all of your results without having to go to each individual platform to do so. Additionally, we also manage the patient experience. So the patient experience is something that we hear a lot of the pain points coming from as well. Let's say that you're working with a patient and you're sending them over 2, 3, 4 different tests at any given time. That can take a lot of support, right? And that support will ultimately fall on your shoulders, on your admin's shoulders if you're lucky enough to have an admin. But at the end of the day, that's going to take potential hours out of your week, which can be spent building your business or spending time with your family or playing golf, right? Just time back in the day that we want to give back to you by providing our software. So just to show you really how it works and how simple it is, you go to rupahealth.com, you sign up for free, and from there you can order tests just by clicking start an order. We just need the patient's first name, last name, and email address. We'll collect all the necessary information to complete the order directly from the patient. So once you're in this order screen, you can do things like setting up custom bundles. A custom bundle is a set of tests, a set of blood panels, whatever you want it to be from any one of the 30 plus labs that we work with and over 3,000 different tests. One click, all those tests added into your cart straight away. Or you can create a favorites list. An individual test that you commonly order, you can put a little heart next to it. And so this way I can order that LPP plus from SpectraCell. Or if I'm looking for a specific test from any one of our labs, I can search for it here within our catalog. From there, it's honestly as simple as clicking send a patient. And that's how you can order from over 30 different labs, over 3,000 different tests in a matter of seconds from one single platform, rupahealth.com, right? Of course, let's go over a little bit more detail on what we can do with those tests. You can do things like scheduling tests out in advance. So if you want to retest a patient in a couple months down the line, you can actually set that on our platform, and it'll go ahead and automatically send that test to the patient when that time comes. Our pricing is really straightforward. We offer wholesale practitioner prices. So those same prices that you would get going directly to the labs, those are the same prices that we offer here at Rupa Health. So potentially we could be saving your patients quite a bit of money and saving you quite a bit of headache when it comes to a ton of questions that be coming in, right? So we'll manage the whole support side of things, which I'll also show you in a moment. From there, we'll go ahead and drop ship the kits to your patients. So you don't have to stock any more kits in office. You can add notes for the patient. You can add notes for us here at Rupa. And also you can add ICD-10 codes. So if your patient does want to submit this for potential reimbursement, you can add those ICD-10 codes straight away through Rupa, and we'll walk your patient through how to create those super bills to submit for insurance for potential reimbursements. Additionally, it'll default to having the patient pay for the order. You do have the option of paying for the order yourself, but I would say 9 out of 10 practitioners probably prefer us to manage billing, and there's a number of reasons why, but the primary reason being you don't have to deal with billing anymore. We'll bill the patient directly. The way that we generate our revenue is very simple. We charge a 7% processing and ordering fee on each order. This is the only way that Rupa generates our revenue here, is just this 7% processing and ordering fee. And that is paid for by whoever's paying for the tests. So if you're having us bill the patient directly, then your patient will be the one absorbing that cost, meaning Rupa is a completely free profile and platform for you to use. The only time you'll ever be charged anything from Rupa is if you decide to pay for the order yourself, which of course you do have the option of doing. You would just bill your patient separately outside of Rupa. And from there, right, you're good to go. We do actually even have the option of adding additional fees. So if you do want to add things such as an interpretation fee onto this order, you can go ahead and add that. From there, it'll just be billed directly to the patient, and you'll connect your bank account to this. And so those fees will flow directly into your bank account. Again, another way that will eliminate the need for having you bill your patient multiple different times for multiple different processes and services. Once you click send on that order, we'll take it from there. As I mentioned, Rupa manages the entire end-to-end patient experience. And this is something that, in my opinion, is equally as valuable, if not more valuable, than just the idea of having everything all in one place. Because when you send that order to your patient, we'll notify your patient. We'll reach out to them and let them know when the order has been shipped out. We'll send over FAQs, instructions, and oftentimes videos on how to take the order. We'll manage any specimen issues that happen. We'll help coordinate any phlebotomy. And from there, we'll follow up with the patient. Once the results are back, you're notified as they come in. So you can just hop right into your Rupa Health account and find all of your results. Additionally, we even have integrations with EHRs such as OptiMantra and Practice Better and even Elation, with many more to come. So those results potentially can flow directly right into your EHR. But this is what it looks like. So as soon as you press send to your patient will receive a notification letting them know that the tests have been ordered for them. Hi, Joshua, Dr. Jordan has ordered these tests for you, and then we will introduce who we are. One really important call out at Rupa is that we accept multiple different payment solutions. So not only can we accept cash and credit, we can accept HSA, we can accept FSA, and we can even set up a 3-month interest-free payment plan. Anybody who's taken these tests before or run these tests knows how expensive they can be, and they can quickly add up, especially if you're doing multiple tests. So providing these different payment solutions makes life much simpler for your patient, as well as lowers that barrier of entry to get access to these oftentimes very expensive tests. If you decide to pay for the test yourself, that's no problem. Like I showed you before, you do have that option. The only difference here is that we're not going to show the patient the cost of the test, right? That's completely up to you. You're managing billing. We will, of course, still show the additional or the tests rather that were ordered for them, but we will not show the cost of those tests. We'll simply just collect the shipping and demographic information needed to complete the order. From there, you're notified as the results come in, or excuse me, you're notified, your patient's notified as the order has been shipped out, and then we will send over an email that looks very similar to this. So we will send over an email that outlines all the instructions, all the necessary steps to fill out the requisition form, and if there is a blood draw required, we can do this in a few different ways. We can either customize those instructions based on your recommendations. So if you do have a preferred phlebotomist or you do them in-house, we can send that information to your patient, or we'll send over the options based on the lab that they're working with. Each lab having their own network of phlebotomists and phlebotomy options. We'll send those to your patient, but let's say that your patient wants a different option. Maybe they want a mobile phlebotomist to come to their house, right? They can reach out to us and our team, and we will search by zip code to send over any available options that will service them in their area. If the patient has any questions, they reach out to us and our team. We will manage patient support end to end. Of course, if it's anything medical related, we will send them back your way. But we want the ideal process to be you come to rupahealth.com, place your orders. We take care of everything in the in-between, and then you're alerted as the results come in. Streamlined, right? Additionally, we'll manage any specimen issues. So if there is an issue that happens with the sample along the way, we'll coordinate that directly with the lab as well as the patient. You'll be alerted, but you won't have to do anything. From there, we'll follow up with the patient, and then you're notified as the results come in. So with that, I'm just going to transition real quick right back into what that all looks like and how you're tracking your orders. And that's on this main screen here. So within this main screen is where you'll track all your orders. You can search by patient. You can filter by status of your orders, and we'll update the status along the way. And I can always click into any of my orders at any time. So I can see, for example, when the sample arrived at the lab, when the results come in, I'm able to hop in here. I can download the results. I can send the results directly to my patient as well. We will not send the results to your patients without your consent, so you have full control over that. And then you can even schedule that clinical consultation. I know I discussed this with Nicole at the very end of the presentation, but should there be offering for a clinical consult, you're able to actually schedule those directly through Rupa, which is amazing. We interface directly with that lab company so that in consultation will be with the lab company, not with a representative from Rupa. So what I've shown you thus far is the Rupa Health platform, which allows you to order all your labs in one place, track and manage all your results, as well as have your patient experience taken care of. The last and final thing I want to show you is Rupa University. So Rupa University is the educational leg of Rupa. The reason why we've created this is there is so much information out there, y'all. I'm sure you know, if you're a practitioner, where do you even start? And so we want to partner with our labs to create content. So things like this live class, which you're actually a part of, and which Nicole and Spectre Cell were a part of today. And we host these live classes generally on a weekly basis where we invite our practitioners to come in and learn about the labs that are offered. We record them, we upload them all here. And so you're able to find a full library of these different classes that we've done thus far with different labs, different practitioners, and learn, continue to learn, find one single spot where you can come in, watch videos and learn. Additionally, beyond live classes, we have a podcast, we have articles that we write, and we even have more in-depth boot camps. So if you are interested in more of a deep dive beyond a 45-minute presentation, you can join one of our 6-week boot camps, which will dive a little bit more in depth into how to interpret these specific tests for these different use cases. You can find it all at rupahealth.com or at rupauniversity.com. But with that, y'all, my name is Adrian, and I'm so excited for y'all to have us, or for y'all to have joined us today. Please join us next week. We actually even have one tomorrow with Gamelli on their SIBO test. So if you are available for that, it's a little bit later in the day, 5 p.m. Pacific. But if you have any questions, my email is adrian@rupahealth.com. More than happy to join a meeting with you or your team to walk through how Rupa can be a potential fit for your business. So last thing here, I saw a meeting or rather a question come in about physician authorization. So physician authorization, let's talk a little bit about that. So at the moment, Rupa Health requires you to be a licensed practitioner with an NPI number and operating in any state other than New York, New Jersey, or Rhode Island. We are working on rolling out a program called physician authorization, which would allow practitioners whose license types may be limiting in their ability to order tests to be able to order tests through a signing physician on Rupa Health. We're currently building that out. I can't give an exact ETA. We did hit a little bit of a speed bump on it, but we're hoping to have that rolled out in the next couple months. It is a massive priority here at Rupa because we want to make sure that those practitioners who are able to order labs have access to be able to order those labs. So soon, as soon as I get a more accurate ETA on that, I promise I'll let you all know during one of these live classes. But thanks again so much for joining us, y'all. And again, my name is Adrian. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'll send out a follow-up email after this presentation later this afternoon. So feel free to reach out to me on that or at adrian@rupahealth.com. And thanks again to Nicole Herms and the team over at SpectraCell for joining us during today's presentation.